Hey, good morning, class. What we're going to talk about again today is we're going to be talking about globalization and we're going to be talking about identity. So, I want everyone to get out their notes from last class. If you were not here last class, this would be a great opportunity for you to kind of get a little bit caught up on what we discussed yesterday. So, our guiding question is going to be, to what extent should globalization shape our identity? Alright, so last class we talked about the different perspectives, and we all know that there's a positive and a negative perspective to globalization. So the positive that we talked about is we are interconnected through many different ways. And we talked about the infusion of cultures, how cultures are starting to meld together. We talked about how there's a sharing of ideas. There's athletic activities. And one great example is the Olympics that's going to be coming up in London this coming summer. We talked about global trade, how goods and services are being traded back and forth. We talked about innovations and technologies. On the negative side, last class we talked about how the world is becoming a much smaller place. So we have an assimilation of cultures. Cultures are all coming together. We talked about how in some cases, in some countries, there's actually been a loss of culture. There's been environmental destruction, and there's been a loss of local and small businesses throughout our country due to a lot of these big corporations moving in. So the elements of globalization. What we talked about is we had 4 different types of elements of globalization. So we had the economic, we had environmental, political, and we had cultural. So with the economic, we talked about cross-border goods and services. We talked about there's an interconnectedness among all the global economies, or a lot of global economies. So one example that we came up with was the European debt crisis, how many nations in Europe are being affected through a couple of countries and their debt crisis, and how that's affecting their economies. We also talked about environmental, the human effects that we find on the environment. So one of the things that we talked about was the BP Gulf spill that happened in the Gulf of Mexico, where there was gallons and gallons of crude oil that was spilt into the Gulf of Mexico, which has really disrupted the environmental ecosystems in that area. We talked about the political, the human rights, labor, and environmental standards that where many different nations are coming together and creating policies and standards that are affecting one nation in particular, or maybe even a continent. So one of the things that we talked about was the crisis in Syria, where many different nations are coming together and trying to solve the issues within Syria. We have cultural, and that's going to be our language, our traditions, and our religions. And we're going to talk more in depth about that today. That's where we're going to really take this conversation. So what I've done is I've got a YouTube video which is going to really summarize what we talked about last class very nicely, actually. So I'm just going to
Globalization is the process whereby the world seems to be getting smaller as it becomes interconnected in many ways, such as culture, ideas, human activities, and trade. Globalization has been around for centuries, possibly since the beginning of trade, but has been rapidly increasing within the last 20 to 30 years. There are different types of globalization. Economic globalization means there's greater global connectedness of economic activities through transnational trade, capital flows, and migration between different countries. Environmental globalization includes the increasingly global effects of human activities on the environment. Cultural globalization emphasizes the connections among languages, ways of living, and fears of global homogeneity through the spread of North American and European languages and culture. Political globalization includes the wider recognition of global political standards such as human rights, democracy, labor standards, and environmental standards, as well as greater organization by governments and other global institutions around the globe. Therefore, globalization takes place because of three main reasons. First, travel. You can travel all around the globe on an airplane or go across country in a train in a much shorter time now than in the past. People have been traveling for a long time. However, you can now get to your destination much quicker. Second, communication technology. Communication is instant through the internet, email, the computer, the telephone, cell phones, text messaging, etc. And third, trade. Trade also seems to make the world smaller because we can buy something made in any country and have it shipped to our house within a day or two. With travel, communication technology, and trade, the world seems like it's getting smaller. This is called living in a global village. Cultures are less distinct and unique. The world seems like it's gravitating towards one assimilated culture. Multinational corporations and their products have connected the world. They want their products all over the world for the profit, and they want to make their products in whatever country will provide the cheapest labor and fewest restrictions. For example, you can go to McDonald's in pretty much any country around the world. How would you like to eat McDonald's in Japan, or buy Nike in Paris? The problems with globalization include the loss of culture, spreading of disease, environmental suffering, and problems for people in least developed countries. Diseases are spread easier because many people are traveling and bringing diseases home with them. The environment is suffering because hazardous wastes and pollutants are being emitted into the air and pollution can travel. People in least developed countries are suffering because multinational corporations are moving factories to these countries for cheap labor. Globalization has both positive and negative effects. We live in this global village and there's no way to stop it. But would we?
Video that summarized very nicely what we discussed last class. So now what we want to talk about is cultural globalization, how it is affecting our identity. Can I have Jeff, maybe you can answer this. According to the video, in what ways are we connected? Do you remember?
Through technology, transportation, and trade.
Excellent. She talked about the interconnectedness of how all the different countries are connected through the internet, through media communications. She talked about how we can get from one destination to another very quickly with different forms of transportation. And she talked about trade, how really we are able to get anything that we would desire from anywhere in the world. And we see that a lot in things like Etsy and eBay. Okay, so there we go. We have our media technologies, we have our transportation, and we have our trade. So now what I want to do is we have an assignment here for you, and everybody has this on their desk. Okay, I've given 8 per table, so please just get a handout. I'm going to go over the assignment with you so that you guys have a good understanding, and then what I'll do is I'll give you an example to help you along. Okay, so last class we discussed the different components of globalization. There's economic, environmental, political, and cultural. We now need to discover how these different components are shaping our own identity. In the space provided, and I've provided the space right here for you, this is where I'd like to have your image. Create an image that represents how globalization has influenced your identity. This image should express your own unique culture and identity. And this can be seen through things like language, music, the hobbies that we do, our own religion. We can even talk about technology, how we dress, our attire, and we can talk about the activities that you enjoy. Using the materials provided, come up with a creative and expressive image that will accurately represent how globalization has affected your identity. Okay, so just on, like I said, on this sheet of paper, you can draw, you can be really creative on how you want to create this. And I have a bunch of stuff up here at the front that you can work on and you can use. All right? So, first thing, illustrate how globalization has shaped your identity. Express how you express your culture. So what are the things that you do that express to everybody, your culture, who you are. And I really want you to be creative. So you can have it a collage, you can have it a drawing, it could be a painting, a picture, a cartoon. However you want to express it will be great. All right? So then what's going to happen, I'm going to give you a quick little example of what elements of identity are visible within this image. Some of the things that I came up with, and you guys feel free to join in if you see anything that I missed. So we see that this guy, he's all in his traditional costume from his particular country, and so we see that he's influenced definitely by the technology. We see that with his cell phone. Maybe media communication, he might be on Facebook for all that we know. You can definitely see some of his religion, maybe even some of his customs, and we can see some of his belief systems. And maybe there's a bit of an obligation. Because, why is he doing this? Is it out of obligation for his religion, his culture, his family? We don't know. So that's kind of an example of how an image can represent who you are as a person. Okay, so once we've done our image, I'm going to give you about 10 minutes to finish that. We're going to share our ideas with the partners, our table groups. And so some of the questions that I really want you guys to focus on are what components of globalization have affected your identity? What aspects of your culture do you think have affected globalization? So, how does globalization affect you? How do you affect globalization? And to what extent do you think globalization should shape your identity? I'm going to give you a little bit more time to work on that, but we'll discuss that once you